I don't think it's a stretch for me to say that gay people in the 20s and 30s had it rough. If you lived outside of a big city, it could be incredibly difficult to connect with other gay people, and even if you did live in a big city, it could still be hard to know where to go and find community. And yet, people found a way. And oftentimes, it wasn't in the ways you might imagine. The 1930s came on the heels of a several decades-long explosion in the societal visibility of queer people in the US. From the massive publicity of the Oscar Wilde trial, to the rise in the sexology field, which banked on pathologizing queerness, to the scandal of the publication of one of the first openly and pro-lesbian novels in the 20s, The Well of Loneliness by Radcliffe Hall. And the 20s itself was a decade overflowing with sudden queer visibility, as it not only became more popular in many places for people of all walks of life to socialize together at social clubs and balls, but it became marginally more accepted for queer people to be more visibly queer in the cities, if not because people tolerated them as part of the urban landscape, then because they made for good entertainment. And in the 20s and 30s, that's exactly what the gays were for most straight people. Salacious entertainment. A number of up-and-coming publications were eager to cash in on straight people's innate curiosity for how these strange queer people live, and the tabloid that took queer sensationalism to the next level was a gossip tabloid called Broadway Brevities. You may remember me mentioning Broadway Brevities in one of my videos from last year where I talked about Juanita Clivet, the poet from New York's Greenwich Village, who told the press that she was Sappho reincarnated. Juanita was close friends with the man who started and ran Broadway Brevities, Stephen G. Clow, and in fact, Juanita wrote for the magazine and was one of the few people to attend Clow's funeral. They were a pretty fitting match, to be honest. A girl banking on the heterosexualized story of a lesbian icon for a quick buck, and a guy banking on the demonization of gay people for a quick buck. But there's a lot more to the story than you might think, and it involves blackmail, scandal, and a guy who became famous for high-diving belly flops? Come learn with me. But before we get into it, let's hear a word from today's sponsor, Atlas VPN. The internet today is a scary place filled with unknown horrors lurking around every corner. So why would you want to be unprotected? Atlas VPN encrypts your data and hides your virtual location so your device gets a new IP and DNS address. Your internet traffic gets encrypted and then sent off to the VPN server and then decrypted and sent right off to its destination, which not only keeps you safe, but also keeps your personal info from prying eyes. Plus, there's a lot more that Atlas VPN can do for you other than just protecting your privacy. You can stream at high speeds, protect an unlimited number of devices, block ads and malware, and of course, save money while online shopping or booking travel, because then websites can't bump the prices based on your location. Also, Netflix, Amazon Prime, and Disney Plus all have geo restrictions due to licensing rights, meaning hundreds of exclusive shows or even streaming services themselves may not be available to you based on your location. With Atlas VPN, you can bypass geo restrictions and access your favorite content from across the world by simply changing your location to the country that has access to the thing you want to watch. Atlas VPN works on any device and comes with a 30-day money-back guarantee for all subscription purchases, so you can try it out and see if you like it. Right now, Atlas VPN is running a huge discount, meaning you can get a 3-year subscription for just $1.39 a month with a 30-day money-back guarantee. Time is running out, so get your deal by clicking the link in the description below so you can start exploring the internet knowing that your privacy is protected. Thank you so much to Atlas VPN for sponsoring this video, and now let's get back to learning about Broadway Brevities. Before the 20s, it was far more common for magazines to be society publications or all-encompassing general content marketed to women. Frequently, they would involve a massive array of content, such as sewing patterns, short stories, opinion pieces, tutorials for makeup and crafts, fashion trend forecasting, advertisements, etiquette advice, and other miscellaneous essays. There were also periodicals that were targeted to men, which were typically specific to niche interests, but it was far more common for newspapers themselves to be the place to find sensationalized stories and gossip. Sometimes high society magazines contained some level of gossip, but it was usually fairly polite or withdrawn because they were mostly being read by the very people that they were talking about. The interwar years, though, saw a huge boom in periodicals and magazines in general, expanding the market massively. More and more magazines began targeting not only niche interests for women, but publishers quickly realized that the public craved some hot, juicy goss as celebrity culture began to rise, with the increased accessibility of theater in places like New York City, as well as the increased production and distribution of silent films. As more papers reported on the stars of Broadway shows and films, the more their names became widely known to the average household audience, and people were very interested in the secret lives of these mysterious celebrities. I mean, really, nothing has changed, has it? In the mid-1910s, a man named Stephen Clow figured he had his finger on the pulse of how to capture the people's attention. Steve Clow was born on Prince Edward Island in 1873 and immigrated to New York City sometime before 1903. His early publishing career was nothing too scandalous. He appeared in magazines a number of times with opinion pieces on poetry, and he worked at the Broadway Publishing Company, which had a magazine, but mostly dealt with Civil War memoirs, poetry, and fiction. It closed in 1917, which is exactly 1 year after Clow moved on to the venture that would last until his death 24 years later, Broadway Brevities. Brevities' early issues were fairly unassuming from the cover originally. It mainly concerned itself with the topics of theater and other entertainment, trying its best to carry the veneer of a society magazine with some level of respectability, at least on the outside. But the inner contents also contained some salacious gossip on well-known New York celebrities, socialites, and entrepreneurs. But as pop culture and culture at large began to shift dramatically in the early 20s, so too did the content of Broadway Brevities, which started to give in to more exciting and taboo topics, namely articles speculating on the queer community. In 1924, it would begin running the column it would become infamous for, A Night in Fairyland, which advertised itself as an investigative deep dive into the hidden, sinful underworld of queer nightlife. The author of the column would recount their experiences in these bars, parties, and nightclubs, giving every detail with a grave tone of shock and alienating disgust. Hilariously, though these columns talked at length about feminine gay men the most, it did make many breathless mentions of lesbians or followers of Sappho. But alas, as one installment said, I was unable to meet lesbians at close range. Because of these circumstances, no competent study of New York's slightly masculine women has yet been published. However, we are informed one is now being prepared by an eminent authority in the field. He assures us that there really is such a place. In fact, many places. Oh, those elusive lesbians. Will Straw, one of the most knowledgeable voices out there on Brevities, theorizes that the Night in Fairyland columns may have been written by Clow himself, as the tone of the writing matches his almost perfectly. And it could make some sense given that some people believe that Clow might have been a gay man, which could have given him the connections needed to know exactly where and when all of these gay events were happening in the first place, and the familiarity to know so much about the people there. Not to mention, it's most likely that he was writing many of these 1930s headliner pieces, and almost all of the ones on queer topics sign off with an author using pseudonyms that utilize gay slang and innuendos that only someone from within the community would understand back then. And though we have little hard proof for either of these theories, what we do know is that in a very backwards way, A Night in Fairyland ended up helping the gay community by telling those with less knowledge and connections, who may be new to the city or just beginning to explore their sexuality, exactly where to find the community's gatherings. Obviously back then, a gay person couldn't just do a little Google search and find the gay bars around or connect with new friends. If you wanted to engage with the community without getting caught and getting yourself arrested or being outed to your family or employer, you had to be very sneaky about how you went about these things. It's the reason why so many men sought out popular cruising grounds such as certain parts of Central Park, certain public restrooms, and Times Square in general to make quick sexual connections. You could get in without being noticed, engage with a stranger you may never see again, and get out quickly if things went south or if the cops showed. Times Square itself, which is literally on Broadway and the epicenter of New York theater, used to be a completely different environment from the advertisement-ridden hellscape that it is today. Today, anyone who lives in New York avoids Times Square at all costs if they can. Personally, I would rather walk several blocks out of my way just to avoid it. Last time I ended up in Times Square, it was completely by accident, and I got trapped in between the huge crowd of K-pop fans waiting to get into the line store and a trash can with a swarm of bees that was being surrounded by the NYPD. But back in the early 1900s, it was one of the biggest gay centers of the city for a number of reasons. It housed the theaters and burlesque houses, it was right next to the Hell's Kitchen tenements where many low-income gay men lived, it had a number of cafeterias that were well known to be gay community favorites, and it was a very popular cruising ground and hub for male sex workers. This made Times Square a center point of a lot of gay-leaning 1930s fiction, like Kenilworth Bruce's Goldie, in which a young man says, he told him about the fairies and wolves that frequent the streets of New York, around the Times Square section. The fairies pull down big dough. There's the actors and musicians when the shows break, there's the gamblers and guys with small-time rackets, and there's the highbrow sots when they leave the speakeasies in the wee hours. Fairies work up a regular trade. Fairy in this time period was a very specific identity. It referred mostly to feminine gay men and could cover a spectrum of people from men who simply acted in a feminine way, all the way to men who actually wore women's clothing. Fairies were usually considered their own gender altogether or an intermediate sex, and a large number of the sex workers were fairies because they had so few other job options. The wolves, on the other hand, referred to men who were undeniably conventionally masculine men, but were overtly set in their sexual preference for other men, usually fairies, and often sought out marriages with them. Wolf was an interchangeable term, though. Many people at the time also used it to refer to older masculine gay men who actively sought partnerships with younger and more inexperienced ones who were called punks. The punks would seek out these sexual relationships in exchange for money or protection from the wolf. This was typically common in prisons, among sailors, or among transient workers. And those two terms aren't even beginning to touch the tip of the iceberg when it comes to the wide array of identity terms that gay men in the early 1900s could have used. Times Square was a silently very organized, hustling situation. There were the more well-dressed and mannered sex workers who catered to the gay middle-class men leaving the theaters, the more casual sex workers on the other side, the fairy prostitutes who catered to both gay men and men who considered themselves normal, and the areas where non-sex workers went to cruise. All of these systems coexisted covertly in the same area. As George Chauncey writes in Gay New York, Times Square served as the primary social center for many such non-residents, a place where they met their friends, built their strongest social ties, let their hair down, and constructed public identities different from those they maintained at work and elsewhere in the straight world. They built a gay world for themselves on the basis of the ties they developed in the commercial institutions entrepreneurs had developed to serve the needs of the theater workers rooming in the district and the tourists who flocked there. People often referred to the hectic streets of the theater district as the frenzied 40s, but Broadway Brevities, the one paper that delighted in identifying the haunts of even the most discreet gay men, went on to nickname the residential area just north of it as the faggy 50s. It wasn't hard for Broadway Brevities to figure out shit to say about gay people. They were literally on Broadway, in the middle of the action, and Broadway theater itself was, and still is, absolutely overflowing with the gays who couldn't give less of a shit about hiding how gay they are. To the straight outsiders, the whole thing was a complete shocking spectacle, maybe even exciting, tantalizing. To gay and questioning readers, the column read like a gay person's guide to the city, however insulting it was. And as time drew on through the Roaring '20s, a new phenomenon began to creep up on New York: the pansy craze. Yeah. Straight people became kind of obsessed with the gays in the 20s to 30s, and Times Square as a result began to evolve into almost a sort of gay carnival that straight people flocked to. It was during this time that A Night in Fairyland ran, and the demand and interest for that kind of content was absolutely there. One New York paper wrote in 1931, "The latest gag about 2 a.m. is to have your picture taken with one or two pansies in Times Square. The queens hang out there for the novel racket." Because of this interest, people started getting hired by the clubs, cabarets, plays and theaters themselves as pansy acts, oftentimes not even queer actors but rather straight ones, putting on a stereotypical overblown performance to mimic or ridicule gay people, which only increased interest as word got around town. But many performers who gained fame were real queer folks. One of the most famous of these queer performers was Jean Malin, whose name I have tried looking up the correct pronunciation for a million times. I can't find a consensus on this. It's either Malin or Malin. I don't know. Jean Malin also had a drag persona named Imogene Wilson. Malin began working as a chorus boy, which failed because people thought that he was too effeminate. So he became a drag competitor and performer at clubs in the village until he was discovered by some Broadway columnists in 1930 and was given a new job as a pansy performer at Club Abbey on Broadway. His job was being the master of ceremonies, meaning he would introduce acts and interact with the audience, and he was extremely popular. Malin was now one of the most famous pansies in New York, but Malin's act was so popular because he didn't just put on the act to be ridiculed like others did. He ridiculed the audience right back. One paper described it as an act meant to infuriate the red-blooded he-men who visited his club with their sweeties. Whoever heckled him would get heckled right back, something that to that point had scarcely been done before to straight people's faces. While his act itself was stereotypical, it also commanded respect in a way. Malin suddenly found himself in a position of power over straight men, and the gay community of New York was loving it. Broadway Brevities reported, "The pansies hailed La Malin as their queen." And, well, they weren't lying, honestly. Many feminine gay men in the city had suffered years of catcalls and jeers from straight men on the street and felt that, in a way, Malin was defending them. On one occasion, Malin entered the cafeteria dressed in drag after a show, which was fairly common, and a columnist reported, "When a party of 4 rough-looking birds tossed a pitcher of hot water at him as he danced by, he pitched into them. After beating 3 of them into insensibility, the fight went into the street, with 2 taxi drivers coming to the assistance of the surviving member of the original foursome. Malin had tears in his eyes and said, 'Yes, he won the fight, but look at the disgraceful state my gown is in.'" What an icon. In 1932, Malin took his act to Hollywood, where he recorded songs, which I'll link below, and appeared in some movies. Unfortunately, Malin died tragically young. In 1933, after a performance at the Ship Cafe in Venice Beach, Malin got into his car with 2 friends, where he got the gears confused, and the vehicle went roaring backwards off the pier into the water. The friends were injured but escaped, but Malin was pinned under the steering wheel and drowned. The popularity of the Pansy Act went on steep decline after this, unrelated to Malin's death, but it couldn't have helped. Although Malin was a big driver of the pansy craze, he wasn't alone. A lot of it has Broadway Brevities to thank, too, as its sensationalist coverage of anything gay not only increased awareness of the gay world, but interest in it too, and undoubtedly drove a lot of people to these clubs and speakeasies. And the results of this popularity were a pretty mixed bag. As George Chauncey continues, "As the pages of Brevities illustrate, the pansy craze made the gay world more visible, to itself and to those seeking to become a part of it, as well as to curious outsiders, even as it subjected it to considerable exploitation. The paper's coverage was often abrasive and demeaning, but it provided a good deal of information about meeting places, prominent figures in the gay world such as Jean Malin, Jackie Mason, and the drag balls, police activity, and the like, which gay readers would have found useful. Many of the cartoons ridiculed gay men and lesbians, but no more than they ridiculed the interactions of presumptive heterosexuals, and some of them showed lesbians in positions of relative power over the men desperately pursuing them. It's a complicated legacy for sure, and we haven't even gotten into the crimes yet." You see, Broadway Brevities actually saw 3 separate runs because Stephen Clow just couldn't stop getting into trouble with the law. In 1924, a U.S. federal grand jury indicted Clow and 2 others on charges of using the mails to defraud. Basically, Clow and his buddies were operating Brevities as a blackmail racket where they were sending threatening letters to people telling them to purchase ad space in the magazine, or else Brevities would publish unsavory stories about them, and if they did purchase ad space, Brevities would run stories that were instead favorable to their reputations. The most prominent of these claims in the case was that of a B.J. Palmer from Davenport, Ohio, who owned the Palmer School for Chiropractors. The trial lasted the entire month of January in 1925 and dominated the New York news. The Sunday News headline read, "Brevities Trial Greatest Show on Earth." and admissions free. Clow was fined $6,000, which is approximately $95,296 in today's money. He was also sentenced to 6 years in Atlanta federal prison, of which he served 2. A few years after this, while Clow served his sentence, a man named Roy Griffith, who was friends with B.J. Palmer, published a huge, scathing expose on Broadway Brevities in the Davenport, Iowa Fountainhead News. He wrote, "I have lived in close proximity to Broadway in New York for years. Broadway is not saint-like, but neither is Main Street. They are both human. Steve Clow knows this too, but apparently he prefers it to sensationally slither in slime. I do not know, to the penny, how much money Steve makes, but I believe he would sign a contract to go over Niagara Falls in a barrel regularly every Friday afternoon, as long as he and the barrel lasted, for a flat salary of not more than $150 a week. He might be willing to part with his immortal soul at a slightly lower figure. No, he is not getting rich as an editor, publisher, and whatnot of Broadway Brevities." The Night in Fairyland column ended on an extremely ominous note right before this first run of Brevities closed upon Clow's imprisonment, reading, "What a dirty mess. Yes, it's about a hint of things present and things to come. Verily, in this year of our Lord 1924, the question is, as a brilliant psychiatrist remarked to us the other day, not of who is, but of who isn't. Into the very warp and woof of our modern social fabric has eaten devastatingly this cancer of sexual inversion, wiping out manhood and womanhood, making a mockery of natural love and of normal behavior, wrecking homes and lives untold. The sickening stench of homosexuality is in the nostrils of all of us, and for all of us its menace is stupendous. It is, indeed, the pestilence that stalks alike at new day and night, enfeebling and degrading our civilization, making a byword of all that is clean and sweet and of good repute. If in these articles Brevities has been able to abate by one jot this epidemic of shameless lechery, then we feel that our efforts have not been in vain, and to such noble purpose are dedicated the still more relentless exposures to come." Yeah. I'd say that foreshadows Brevities' second run perfectly. When Clow was released from prison, it didn't take long for him to resurrect Broadway Brevities, although his name would disappear from the list of editors and execs in 1931 for unknown reasons. This new version of the tabloid sought to be even more loud and scandalous than before. While it still contained a lot of gossipy columns about specific public figures, a great deal of its content now focused on vice topics. Of course, it still loved to talk about queer folks, but now it was also increasingly interested in graphic concerns surrounding promiscuity, sex work, racism, and white slavery, xenophobia, and more. The real eye-catcher here, aside from the sensationalist and graphic headlines, is obviously the raunchy and typically deeply offensive cover cartoons. There wasn't just one cartoonist doing these, but rather a large number of artists at the time, many of whom I couldn't find any info on, or who only signed with their first name, probably to protect themselves from being associated with such a rancid paper. But one artist I did find a lot of info on was one of the most common too, Henry Lamothe. Now, Henry was responsible for a lot of Brevities' worst cover cartoons. Many of them were extremely graphic or racist caricatures, and we'll never know how much of this was dictated by the paper and how much was Henry's creative decisions, but either way, he had no qualms with putting his full, real name in big letters on every single one of them. And let me tell you, I don't know what I was expecting when I went looking for info on Henry, but oh my god. So apparently he was from Chicago and became a life drawing model at the Art Institute of Chicago. Everything comes back to SAIC, I swear to God. He later took on odd jobs to support his dream career of being a Charleston dancer, where he claims he invented some famous Lindy Hop moves that inspired the name of the dance style altogether. He made his way to New York, where to survive the Great Depression, he took on illustration jobs, which is where he landed at Broadway Brevities. I honestly wouldn't be shocked if some of his work later inspired the cartoonist Robert Crumb, aka my least favorite cartoonist of all time. Brevities' lasting legacy is not exactly a great one, but what did Henry do after Brevities? He became famous for being a professional high-diving belly flopper.
He does the impossible!
Yes, I'm dead serious. His job was being really old and belly flopping from great heights into shallow water.
Henry, how old are you?
7'7".
As I mentioned before, Henry uses 3 forms of Eastern practice. At the top, it's yoga. And aiming for the pool, he uses Zen. When Henry hits the water, it's karate.
He did this well until past his 70s and made numerous TV appearances.
How do you feel? I don't know yet.
Henry said that before a dive he would drink a ton of coffee as a laxative because it gave his stomach an excited feeling. So that's what happened to our friend Henry Lamothe, who, along with the other front cover artists, was arguably one of the main reasons why New Brevities saw any success at all, albeit temporary. Brevities was destined to burn fast and bright and die as quickly. So what killed it the second time? In 1932, the licensing commissioner of the city of New York banned Brevities from being sold on newsstands, and it died in 1933. The Brevities writers scrambled to other tabloids like the New York Tattler and went on to find other jobs. In the wake of Brevities' demise, other copycat tabloids began to pop up more and more, and in 1933, Stephen Clow went to write for the Broadway Tattler, now going by Steve, as if that was gonna fool anyone. It didn't. According to famous columnist Louis Sobol, who wrote his memoir The Longest Street about his days reporting on Broadway and the famous names he came to know, Steve spent many of these years desperately asking his friends for loans and favors and struggling quite a bit. His last-ditch effort at tabloid success saw him fleeing to Toronto to give Brevities one last shot. He ended up working for a guy named Morris Rubin, and together they launched the Canadian version of Broadway Brevities in 1937. The magazine leaned heavily on retelling old stories from the 20s of New York's third sexers and inverts and sex perverts. It was basically just republishing old Brevities content, including A Night in Fairyland, which they renamed Nights in Queerland. It wasn't long, though, before Clow and Rubin, now going by Ruby, got into legal trouble in Canada due to the obscene contents of their publications. The charges were dropped, but it was enough to force Clow to hastily return to New York in 1938. He spent the last few years of his life begging his friends for money, and died alone of cancer at New York's Bellevue Hospital in 1941. Only a few friends attended his funeral, including Evelyn Nesbit, the wife of Henry Thaw, the guy who murdered Stanford White in 1906, Juanita Clivet, the Sappho of Greenwich Village, who we all know at this point, and strangely enough, Maxwell Maddock, the prosecutor who went after Clow in his trial in 1925. Louis Sobol wrote, Clow's wasted career came to an end on June 6, 1941, in a charity ward at Bellevue. Once the top chronicler of Broadway's romances, tragedies, and scandals, in the era preceding the gossip columnist of the newspapers, Clow was king in his own narrow and slightly sordid walk until he made the mistake for which society never forgave him: blackmail. He expiated his sin in prison, and the gay life which he had known when he ran his little magazine Broadway Brevities came to an end. Thereafter were endless days of hunger, humiliation, and disgrace. In another of his final letters to me, he offered thanks for another minor loan and hinted that at last a break for the better seemed imminent. He was certain that he would not have to trouble me again, and would, in fact, be able to at long last repay the loans. Death took him 4 days later. After Brevities died, the US saw a substantial increase in covert gay media and publications. Oftentimes, this meant that gay people were actually hijacking media in a way, utilizing pre-existing and acceptable things to find each other in secret. One of these was Bachelor magazine, which never outright discussed queer topics, but instead spoke of it in a roundabout way or in code, rather implying gayness. The ones that get it, get it. The ones who don't, don't. One magazine that was used as a place for gay people to connect was the Hobby Directory, first published in 1946. It was basically used as a huge personals page where men sought out other men with similar hobbies, so it's no wonder it started getting used for men to connect for other hobbies. Michael Waters writes, subscribers professed their fascination with physical culture, wrestling, and outdoor life, or their desire to make friends among cowboys, shepherders, miners, lumberjacks, ranch hands, sailors, and guys who wear Levi's, cords, leather jackets with pep in their step and a sparkle in their eyes. A Los Angeles subscriber in the June 1950 issue boasted that his collections included photos of physical activities and said that he wanted to meet other such collectors, weightlifters, and athletic models. Historian Martin Meeker also found copies in the personal archive of Boas Burke, a gay man who openly used the hobby directory to cruise for other gay men. In one copy, Burke wrote in the margins, "A truly beautiful experience, I think, when true friends are made by pen and ink." As long as sympathetic writing on homosexuality was classified as obscene, they didn't have any other option. Though in the grand scheme of things, all of the Brevities' incarnations were extremely short-lived, their influence is palpable. Brevities spawned a huge number of imitators: the New York Tattler, the New York Daily News, the New York Daily Mirror, published by William Randolph Hearst, the New York Evening Graphic, and later Confidential, Hush Hush, Rave, and Suppressed. All of which piled on top of each other to be a more outrageous, more catty, and more shocking than the last. And Brevities was really one of, if not the first, to set this tone. Between its breathlessly scandalized articles to Steve Clow's overly dramatic articles, many of which were just hurling petty accusations at people he believed were slighting or copying him, but ironically, despite its obviously out-loud homophobia, which absolutely increased visibility for the gay communities in ways that were harmful, Brevities also ended up, in a way, helping the community too, whether it ever intended to or not. By publicizing all of these details about gay life, it undoubtedly helped a massive number of gay people actually find the community where they otherwise never would have known where to go. It also introduced the public to the finer details of gay identities at the time, explaining the definitions of words like punk or fairy or queen, exposing people to gay slang. While this exposure did help make it easier for straight people to ridicule gay people with more specificity, and undoubtedly gave hateful people more reasons to hate the gays, it also simultaneously acted as a sort of access gateway for gay people. As Will Straw writes, if you were queer looking for a place to go, you would read these exposés that were damning of these places because that was your only way of knowing where to go. It was kind of counter-reading. Readers are supposed to be shocked, but they use it to tell them where to go. You could take the episodes of Nights in Fairyland and publish it as a guidebook for gay tourists in New York. It's a complicated legacy for sure. Unfortunately, in time periods like the 20s and 30s, when marginalized people had so little representation and access to public life, offensive media like this was all that they had, and they had to glean whatever good that they could from it. It's a good thing that, though we still have a lot of struggles to tackle, the same can't be said today, in the US at least. Thank you so much for joining me in this exploration of Broadway Brevities' short but sordid history. If you want to hear more stories about the queer history of New York specifically, you can watch my videos on Juanita Clivet or the mob-run gay bars. Click the link in the description or pinned comment below to get a 3-year subscription to Atlas VPN for just $1.39 a month with a 30-day money-back guarantee. Hop on that soon because it won't last forever. So as always, wash thy hands, wear thy masks, and stay safe out there while we get through this really bad COVID spike.